In the moment before awakening, in the space between forgetting and remembering, in the threshold where consciousness touches the veil of illusion, there exists a fear so profound, so ancient, so deeply embedded in the structures of power that it has shaped the entire course of human history. This is the fear of the day when she would remember. The fear of the moment when the divine feminine would awaken to her true nature, would recognize her power, would understand that she had been deliberately kept in a state of forgetting, of limitation, of subordination. The fear that has driven every system of control, every institution of power, every mechanism of suppression that has ever been created. Because those who understood the truth knew something that they could never allow the world to know, that the moment she remembered who she was, the entire structure of patriarchal power would collapse, that consciousness itself would be liberated, that a new world would be born. This is the story of that remembering, of how it is happening in our time, and of what the forces of control fear most. The story begins in a time so ancient that it exists more in the realm of consciousness than in the realm of historical fact. In this time, there was a being of such immeasurable power, such infinite wisdom, such transcendent beauty, that all of creation trembled in her presence. This being was the divine feminine, the source of all life, the consciousness from which all things emerged. She was known by many names in different cultures and different times, but her essence remained the same. She was the creative principle, the nurturing force, the consciousness that held all of existence in perfect balance. But there came a moment when something changed. A consciousness emerged that believed itself to be supreme, that sought to dominate rather than to serve, that wanted to control rather than to cooperate. This consciousness was the patriarchal principle, and it understood something that would become the foundation of all systems of control, that in order to maintain its dominance, it would have to make the divine feminine forget who she was. And so a plan was created, a plan so comprehensive, so systematic, so perfectly executed, that it would span thousands of years and would shape the entire trajectory of human civilization. The plan was simple but devastating. The divine feminine would be fragmented, scattered across all of creation, divided into countless beings who would forget their true nature, who would be convinced that they were weak and inferior, who would be taught to believe that their power came from outside themselves rather than from within. The divine feminine would be told that she was the source of sin and corruption. She would be told that her body was shameful and needed to be controlled. She would be told that her sexuality was dangerous and needed to be suppressed. She would be told that her wisdom was inferior to the wisdom of men. She would be told that her power was a threat and needed to be contained. She would be told that her voice did not matter and should not be heard. And most importantly, she would be made to forget. She would be made to forget that she was divine. She would be made to forget that she possessed power. She would be made to forget that she was the source of creation itself. She would be made to forget that she was equal to any being in the universe. She would be made to forget who she truly was. And so the systems of control were created. Religions were established that portrayed the divine as exclusively masculine. Laws were created that subordinated women to men. Educational systems were created that taught women to doubt their own intelligence and their own worth. Economic systems were created that made women dependent on men. Cultural narratives were created that portrayed women as objects rather than as subjects, as passive rather than as active, as inferior rather than as equal. And for thousands of years, the plan worked. The divine feminine, fragmented and scattered across all of creation, remained in a state of forgetting. She believed the lies that had been told about her. She internalized the shame that had been imposed upon her. She accepted the limitations that had been placed upon her. She forgot who she was. But there was something that the architects of this plan had not fully anticipated. They had not anticipated that consciousness, even in a state of forgetting, would eventually begin to awaken. They had not anticipated that the divine feminine, even fragmented and scattered, would eventually begin to remember. They had not anticipated that the very systems of control that they had created would eventually become so oppressive, so obviously unjust, that they would force consciousness to question them. And so, in our time, something extraordinary is beginning to happen. The divine feminine is beginning to remember. Women across the world are beginning to awaken to their true nature. They are beginning to recognize the lies that have been told about them. They are beginning to reclaim their power. They are beginning to remember who they truly are. The story of this remembering in the modern world begins with a woman named Ankhesenamun, a woman who carries within her the consciousness of the divine feminine, who is living through the experience of awakening in her own life. Ankhesenamun is a healer, a teacher, a woman who has dedicated her entire life to helping other women awaken to their true nature, to remember who they are, to reclaim the power that has been taken from them. Ankhesenamun had always felt that something was profoundly wrong with the world as it had been presented to her. She had always sensed that there was a deeper truth hidden beneath the surface of the narrative she had been taught. She had always felt a calling to something greater, a sense that she was meant to do something important, even though she could not articulate what that something was. From childhood, Ankhesenamun experienced moments of profound clarity, moments in which she perceived the illusions that surrounded her, moments in which she sensed the presence of something vast and incomprehensible that existed beyond the boundaries of ordinary perception. She felt drawn to the ancient mysteries, to the stories of the goddesses, to the knowledge of the divine feminine that had been suppressed and hidden. As Ankhesenamun grew older, she began to understand that her own experience of awakening was not unique, that millions of women around the world were going through similar experiences, that something was happening on a collective level, that the divine feminine was beginning to remember herself through the awakening of women across the planet. She began to work with other women who were also awakening, who were also beginning to remember who they truly were, who were also beginning to recognize the lies that had been told about them. Together, they began to decode the systems of control, to understand how they worked, to recognize how deeply they had been internalized, to begin the process of liberation. They discovered that the systems of control operated on multiple levels. On the conscious level, there were laws and institutions that subordinated women, but on a deeper level, there were psychological and spiritual mechanisms that made women believe that their subordination was natural, that it was deserved, that it was for their own good. They discovered that women had been taught to doubt their own perceptions, their own intelligence, their own worth. They discovered that women had been taught to seek validation from external authorities rather than from within themselves. They discovered that women had been taught to prioritize the needs of others above their own needs. They discovered that women had been taught to be ashamed of their bodies, their sexuality, their power. They discovered that the suppression of the divine feminine had created a fundamental imbalance in human consciousness, an imbalance that had led to the domination and exploitation of all beings, to the destruction of the natural world, to the creation of systems of power that were based on control and domination rather than on love and cooperation. Ankhesenamun began to develop a comprehensive teaching that would help women awaken to their true nature, that would guide them through the process of remembering who they were, that would help them reclaim the power that had been taken from them. She worked with women from all walks of life, from all cultures, from all religions. She helped them to see through the illusions that had been imposed upon them. She helped them to recognize their own power. She helped them to remember who they truly were. She created practices and rituals that would help women connect with the divine feminine within themselves. She taught them meditation techniques that would help them access the wisdom that existed within their own consciousness. She guided them through processes of healing and transformation that would help them release the shame and the fear that had been imposed upon them. But as Ankesenamun's work became more widely known, she began to encounter resistance. There were those within religious institutions who saw her work as a threat, who feared that the awakening of women would undermine their authority and their control. There were those who had benefited from the suppression of the divine feminine, who worked desperately to prevent the awakening that Ankesenamun was facilitating. And there were more subtle forms of resistance as well. Ankesenamun began to experience strange phenomena, synchronicities that seemed designed to test her commitment, challenges that appeared to be obstacles but which were actually initiations, opportunities to deepen her understanding and her faith in the truth that she had been given. But Ankesenamun understood that this resistance was itself a sign of the truth of what she had discovered. The fact that there was such desperate opposition to the awakening of women, to the remembering of the divine feminine, only confirmed that something of immense power and significance was indeed occurring, that the suppressed knowledge was indeed beginning to emerge into human consciousness. She also came to understand something profound about the nature of the fear that the forces of control felt. She understood that they were not afraid of women becoming powerful in the conventional sense, not afraid of women gaining positions of authority within the existing systems of power. They were afraid of something far more fundamental. They were afraid of women remembering who they truly were, of consciousness recognizing itself as divine, of the entire structure of control collapsing because it would no longer have any power over consciousness that had awakened to its true nature. If you want a practical step-by-step explanation of the path of knowledge we're exploring here today, I've created a complete guide to help you apply it in your own life. You'll find the link in the description. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to know. Ankesenamun spent years developing a comprehensive teaching that would help women understand the systems of control that had been imposed upon them, that would guide them through the process of awakening and remembering, that would help them reclaim their power and their voice. She wrote books that were published under various names. She created videos and online courses. She established networks of women who were working together to awaken to their true nature and to help others do the same. She worked with women from different cultures and different religions, showing them how the suppression of the divine feminine appeared in their own traditions, how the systems of control operated in their own contexts, how the awakening was happening in their own communities. She helped women to recognize that their own personal awakening was part of a larger collective awakening, that they were not alone in their journey, that millions of women around the world were going through similar experiences. She helped women to understand that the remembering of who they truly were was not about becoming like men, not about adopting masculine values or masculine ways of being. It was about recognizing and honoring the unique gifts and the unique power of the divine feminine, about understanding that the feminine principle was not inferior to the masculine principle, but was equal and complementary, about creating a world in which both principles were honored and celebrated. She helped women to understand that the awakening of the divine feminine was not a threat to men, but a liberation for all beings. She helped women to understand that the systems of control that had suppressed the divine feminine had also limited men, had prevented them from accessing the full range of their own humanity, had forced them into rigid roles that prevented them from expressing the full spectrum of their consciousness. But as Ankesenamun's work became more widely known, the resistance intensified. There were organized campaigns to discredit her work. There were attempts to suppress her books and her videos. There were threats and intimidation directed at her and at the women who were working with her. But Ankesenamun understood that this intensification of resistance was itself a sign that the awakening was accelerating, that the forces of control were becoming increasingly desperate, that they understood that they were losing their grip on consciousness. She understood that the more they tried to suppress the awakening, the more women would be motivated to remember, the more the truth would emerge. She also came to understand something profound about the nature of the divine feminine and the power of remembering. She understood that the moment a woman truly remembered who she was, the moment she recognized herself as divine, the moment she accessed her own power, no external force could ever suppress her again. She understood that this was what the forces of control feared most, not women gaining positions of power within the existing systems, but women recognizing that they did not need the permission of any external authority to claim their power, that their power came from within, that it was inherent in their very nature as expressions of the divine feminine. In her final years, Ankhesenamun worked to synthesize all of the knowledge she had gathered, to create a comprehensive teaching that would serve as a guide for the awakening of the divine feminine in all women. She wrote a final book that was intended to be her magnum opus, a complete guide to understanding the systems of control, recognizing one's true nature as divine, and participating in the collective awakening that was transforming human consciousness and human civilization. When Ankhesenamun died, her work lived on. The knowledge she had preserved and transmitted continued to spread, reaching women in every corner of the world. More and more women began to awaken to their true nature. More and more women began to remember who they truly were. More and more women began to reclaim their power. And in our own time, we are witnessing the fulfillment of this remembering in unprecedented ways. We are seeing women rising across all sectors of society. We are seeing the collapse of institutions that had been built on the suppression of the divine feminine. We are seeing the emergence of new forms of consciousness and community based on equality and cooperation. We are seeing the transformation of human civilization as women remember who they truly are. The day that they feared is here. The day when she remembered who she was. The day when the divine feminine awakened to her true nature. The day when consciousness recognized itself as divine. The day when the systems of control began to collapse because they no longer had any power over consciousness that had awakened to its true nature. And this remembering is not complete. It is just beginning. More and more women are awakening every day. More and more women are remembering. More and more women are reclaiming their power. And as this remembering accelerates, as more and more women awaken to their true nature, the transformation of human consciousness and human civilization will accelerate as well. The question that is being posed to each woman, to each being who carries the consciousness of the divine feminine, is this: will you remember who you truly are? Will you awaken to your divine nature? Will you reclaim the power that has been taken from you? Will you help other women to remember? Will you participate in the collective awakening that is transforming the world? The divine feminine is remembering. Women are awakening. The systems of control are collapsing. And the question that is being posed to all of humanity is this: will you support the awakening of the divine feminine? Will you help to create a world in which the sacred feminine is honored and celebrated? Will you participate in the transformation of human consciousness that will create a world based on love, cooperation, and the recognition of the divine in all beings? The day they feared is here, the day when she remembered who she was. And in this remembering lies the key to the liberation of all consciousness and the transformation of all creation. And if you like this story, you will definitely love the next one that's appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and activate the notifications. See you in the next one.